The agronomist dug the shovel in, pulled up a block of soil, and stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned it over in his hands, broke it apart, counted the earthworms, lost count at 40. He'd been testing soil across McLean County, Illinois, for 22 years. He'd never seen anything like this. Not in a lab, not in a textbook, not in a field that had been farmed continuously for over a century. "Who manages this ground?" he asked. "I do," said the farmer, standing behind him. "What are you putting on it?" "Nothing. Haven't put anything on it in 15 years. The agronomist looked at the soil in his hands, then looked at the farmer, then looked back at the soil. He didn't say anything for a long time. 15 years earlier, a chemical sales rep had stood in this same field and told this same farmer that if he stopped spraying, his soil would be dead in 3 seasons. The soil wasn't dead. The soil was the most alive ground in the county. Before I take you back to that conversation, let me tell you something. This channel tells the stories that nobody else is telling. The forgotten farmers, the overlooked land, the deals that changed everything. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit subscribe right now. Every subscriber tells me to keep digging for the next story. And trust me, the one I'm about to tell you is worth staying for. Let me take you back. In March of 1993, a 32-year-old farmer named Warren Kepley sat across a kitchen table from a man named Dennis Corrigan and said 4 words that ended a business relationship. "I'm done spraying, Dennis." Dennis Corrigan was 46 years old, regional sales manager for Prairie Agricultural Solutions, one of the largest chemical distributors in central Illinois. He'd been selling herbicides, pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers to McLean County farmers for 18 years. He drove a company truck with the Prairie Ag logo on the door, wore khaki pants and a polo shirt, with the company name on the chest, and carried a briefcase full of product data sheets and financing terms. He made good money. His customers made good yields. The system worked, or so everyone believed. Warren Kepley had been one of Dennis's best accounts. 280 acres of prime Illinois black dirt outside of Lexington, about 20 miles north of Bloomington. The Kepley family had farmed this ground since 1919. Warren's grandfather, Arthur Kepley, had broken the prairie with a team of horses. His father, Dale, had modernized in the 1960s, added chemicals in the 1970s, expanded yields through the 1980s. When Dale died of a stroke in 1991, Warren took over at 30 years old. For 2 years, Warren ran the operation exactly the way his father had. Full chemical program, anhydrous ammonia in the fall, pre-emergent herbicides in the spring, fungicide if the season was wet, insecticide if the bugs showed up. The chemical bill ran about $38,000 a year. That was normal for 280 acres in McLean County. Everyone paid it. Nobody questioned it. Then Warren's grandmother said something that changed everything. Dorothy Kepley was 84 years old in 1993. She'd been married to Arthur for 51 years before he died in 1987. She'd worked beside him on this same ground from 1938 until he retired in 1979. She remembered the farm before chemicals. One evening in February, Warren was sitting with her at the kitchen table going over his expenses. The chemical bill was staring at him. $38,000, more than he spent on anything else combined. "Grandma, did Grandpa spend this much on inputs?" Dorothy looked at the number. "Your grandfather never spent a nickel on chemicals in his life. How did he grow anything?" "He grew cover crops, clover, rye, hairy vetch. Turned them under in the spring. The soil fed the crop and the cover crop fed the soil. He used to say the soil is a living thing. You feed it right, it feeds you back. You poison it, it dies slow and takes you with it." His yields must have been terrible. His yields were fine. Not as high as what your father got with chemicals, but his costs were nothing. Arthur kept more money farming without chemicals than your father kept farming with them. The difference is, Arthur didn't have a chemical salesman telling him he needed to spend $38,000 a year to grow corn. Warren sat with that for 3 weeks. He pulled his grandfather's old farm records from a trunk in the attic. Arthur had kept meticulous notes: yield per acre, costs per acre, net profit per acre, going back to 1938. The numbers told a story nobody had bothered to read. Arthur's average corn yield from 1938 to 1979 was 95 bushels per acre. Dale's average with full chemical inputs from 1980 to 1991 was 145 bushels per acre. But Arthur's input cost was about $12 per acre. Dale's was $135 per acre. When Warren calculated net profit per acre, yield times price minus costs, the numbers were closer than anyone would have guessed. Arthur netted about $180 per acre in inflation-adjusted dollars. Dale netted about $210 per acre. Dale made more, but only $30 per acre more, while spending 10 times as much on inputs and taking on all the risk that came with those costs. Warren closed the ledger and made his decision. The next day, Dennis Corrigan came by for his annual spring planning visit. Same visit he'd made every March for 18 years. Same briefcase, same product sheets, same financing terms, same assumption that Warren would sign the order. "I'm done spraying, Dennis." Dennis set down his coffee. "Excuse me?" "I'm not ordering chemicals this year. Not herbicides, not pesticides, not synthetic fertilizer. None of it." "Warren, that's insane. You can't farm 280 acres of corn and soybeans without inputs. Your yields will collapse. You'll have weeds up to your chest by July. Your soil will be depleted in 2 years. My grandfather farmed this ground for 40 years without a drop of chemicals and kept his yields above 90 bushels. That was a different era. The weed pressure is different now. The soil biology is different. You've been running a chemical program for over a decade. You can't just stop cold turkey. The soil doesn't know how to function without inputs anymore." "Then I'll teach it." Dennis leaned forward. "Warren, I've been in this business for 18 years. I've seen exactly 2 farmers try to go chemical-free. Both of them came crawling back within 2 seasons. One of them lost 40 acres to water hemp because he wouldn't spray. The other's corn looked like a science experiment gone wrong. You'll lose this farm if you do this." "I'll lose this farm if I keep spending $38,000 a year on chemicals and praying the yields cover it. The yields always cover it. Until they don't. One bad year, drought, low prices, hail, and that $38,000 is the difference between keeping the farm and losing it." Dennis stood up, gathered his briefcase. "Warren, I like you. Your father was a good customer and a good man. But this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard a farmer say. You're going to kill this soil. And when your yields collapse and your fields are full of weeds, don't call me, because I might not have product to sell you by then." He walked out. Warren sat at the kitchen table and wondered if everyone was right and he was crazy. "I want to ask you something. Have you ever stopped doing something everyone around you was doing because you realized it didn't make sense, even though quitting felt more dangerous than continuing?" Drop a comment and tell me about it, because what Warren did next is going to change how you think about soil. Here's what Warren did in the spring of 1993. Instead of applying anhydrous ammonia and pre-emergent herbicides, he planted cover crops: cereal rye after his soybean fields, crimson clover after his corn. He let them grow through the winter and into the spring, then terminated them with a roller crimper he built in his shop from plans he found in a university extension bulletin. The cover crops died and formed a thick mat on the soil surface. Warren planted his cash crops directly into that mat using a no-till planter. No tillage, no chemicals, just seeds going into soil protected by a blanket of dead cover crop. The first year was rough. His corn yielded 98 bushels per acre, down from 145 the year before. His soybeans made 34 bushels, down from 48. The fields looked ragged compared to his neighbor's clean, chemical-treated rows. Weeds poked through the cover crop mat in places. It wasn't pretty. The county noticed. Dennis Corrigan noticed. Everyone noticed. Kepley's fields look like hell, they said at the co-op. Weeds everywhere. Yields are down 30%. He'll be back on chemicals by next spring. Warren heard all of it, kept going. Year 2 was worse. Corn dropped to 88 bushels. The soil was adjusting. The microbial life that had been suppressed by a decade of chemicals was slowly rebuilding, but it takes time. Warren's neighbors were averaging 160 bushels with their full chemical programs. The gap was enormous, visible from the road. His neighbor to the south, a farmer named Gene Halstead, who farmed 400 acres with a full chemical program, stopped Warren at the mailbox one afternoon in August. "Warren, I've been farming next to your family for 20 years. Your father ran a good operation. What you're doing to his ground is a crime." "It's my ground now, Gene. You're letting it go to hell. I've got water hemp blowing off your fields onto my land. Your corn looks like it belongs in a third-world country. And you're dragging down property values for every farm in the township. My weeds are my problem. I'll deal with them." "You're not dealing with them. That's the point. You're some kind of environmental activist now? Trying to prove a point about chemicals? Because the rest of us are trying to make a living, and your little experiment is making it harder." Warren looked at Gene. "How much did you spend on chemicals last year, Gene?" "That's none of your business." 45,000? 50? And what did you net per acre?" Gene didn't answer. "I spent 4,000. My yields are lower, yes, but I kept more money per acre than you did, and next year my costs will be the same while yours go up, and the year after that, and the year after that." Gene walked away, told everyone at the diner that Warren Kepley had lost his mind. Dennis drove past Warren's farm in August of 1994 and stopped his truck, got out, looked at the corn, shook his head. Then he drove to the next farm, where his customers' fields were tall and green and uniform, and felt vindicated. But Warren was looking at something Dennis couldn't see. He was looking at his soil. And his soil was changing. The earthworm population had tripled in 2 years. The soil structure was shifting, less compacted, more porous, holding water better. When he dug a shovel into the ground, it went in easy, where a year ago it had been like pushing into concrete. The cover crop roots were breaking up the hardpan that decades of tillage and chemical application had created. More importantly, Warren was looking at his bank account. His input costs had dropped from $38,000 to $4,200. Seed for cover crops, fuel, and a few mechanical parts. That was it. His yields were lower, yes, but his costs had fallen by nearly $34,000. Net profit per acre was almost identical to what it had been with chemicals. He was making the same money while spending almost nothing. Nobody at the co-op was doing that math. They only saw the yields. Year 3. Corn came back to 105 bushels. The soil biology was rebuilding. Mycorrhizal fungi were recolonizing the root zones. The cover crop mat was suppressing weeds better as Warren learned which species worked best. He added radishes to his cover crop mix. Their deep taproots broke up compaction and pulled nutrients from the subsoil. Year 5. Corn hit 120. Soybeans hit 42. The gap between Warren and his neighbors was narrowing, and his costs were still under $5,000, while theirs were approaching $45,000. Gene Halstead stopped complaining about Warren's weeds around year 6, not because the weeds were gone, but because Gene had other problems. Chemical-resistant water hemp was showing up on Gene's own fields, the same weeds that years of herbicide use had selected for. Gene was now spending an extra $8,000 a year on specialty herbicides to fight weeds that his regular program had created. Warren's cover crop fields, meanwhile, had less weed pressure every year because the thick cover crop mat smothered weeds naturally. Year 8. Something happened that nobody expected. Warren's corn hit 138 bushels, within 7 bushels of the county chemical average. His soybeans hit 46, essentially equal, but his input costs were $4,800 while the county average was $48,000. Warren was making more money per acre than any farmer in McLean County, not because his yields were higher, because his costs were almost zero. Dennis Corrigan heard about it at a sales meeting. One of his colleagues mentioned the Kepley operation. That guy who quit chemicals? Still farming? Still farming. Yields are back up. Costs are nothing. He's netting more per acre than anyone in the county. Dennis didn't believe it. Drove out to Warren's place that weekend, stood at the fence line and looked at the corn. It was tall, it was healthy. The soil between the rows was covered in residue, no bare ground anywhere, no weeds to speak of. He didn't go to the door, just stood at the fence, looked at the field, and drove home. Let me tell you about 2007, because that's the year the weather proved everything. The drought hit central Illinois in June and didn't let go until September. 4 months of below-normal rainfall, the hottest summer in 20 years. Corn across the county was burning up, leaves curling by early July, tassels firing before ears filled. The chemical-treated fields, the ones with bare, tilled, compacted soil, couldn't hold moisture. Water ran off instead of soaking in. Roots hit hardpan at 8 inches and couldn't go deeper. The county average corn yield that year was 94 bushels per acre, down from the typical 155. Farmers who'd been spending $45,000 on chemicals were looking at yields that barely covered their input costs. Some didn't cover them at all. Warren Kepley's corn yielded 131 bushels per acre. His soil, rebuilt over 14 years of cover cropping and no chemicals, held water like a sponge. The organic matter content had gone from 3.2% when he started to 6.8%, double what his neighbors had. That extra organic matter held an additional 80,000 gallons of water per acre. His roots went down 30 inches through, soil that had no hardpan. His cover crop residue shaded the ground and prevented evaporation. While every farm around him was dying of thirst, Warren's fields were green. Gene Halstead, the neighbor who'd accused Warren of committing a crime against his father's ground, lost 60% of his corn in the drought. His chemically treated, heavily tilled soil baked into concrete by mid-July. Water pooled on top instead of soaking in. His yields dropped to 68 bushels per acre. After subtracting his $52,000 chemical bill, Gene lost money that year, real money. He took out an operating loan to cover the shortfall and spent the winter wondering how he'd pay it back. Warren, with his $4,800 in input costs and his 131-bushel yield, netted more per acre that year than he had in any previous season. The drought that devastated everyone around him had barely touched his fields. Jean drove past Warren's farm in September, saw the corn still standing tall and green while his own fields were brown stubble, and pulled over, sat in his truck for 10 minutes just looking, then drove home without saying a word. The county extension agent, a man named Dr. Paul Ventura, visited Warren's farm in the spring of 2008. He'd been monitoring Warren's operation from a distance for years, skeptical at first, then curious, then increasingly amazed after watching Warren's fields survive the 2007 drought. Now he needed to see the soil up close. That's when he dug the shovel in and counted 40 earthworms in a single spadeful of soil. "Warren, I've been testing soil in this county for 22 years. This is the healthiest ground I've ever seen. The structure, the biology, the organic matter. This is what soil looked like before we started farming it. Except you are farming it, and you outperformed every chemically managed field in the county during the worst drought in 20 years. The soil knows what to do. I just stopped getting in its way." Dr. Ventura published a case study on Warren's operation the following year. It was picked up by 3 agricultural journals. Warren started getting calls from farmers across the Midwest wanting to learn what he'd done. Dennis Corrigan called in the fall of 2008. Warren hadn't heard from him in years. "Warren, it's Dennis Corrigan." "I know who you are, Dennis. I owe you an apology, a big one. I told you you'd kill your soil. I told you your yields would collapse. I told you you'd lose the farm. I was wrong about all of it." "You were selling what you were taught to sell." "I was selling what made me money. That's different. I knew some of those farmers couldn't afford what I was selling them. I knew the costs were eating them alive, but I kept selling because that's what my job was." "Why are you calling now?" "Because I retired last month, and I've been driving around the county looking at farms, and yours is the only one that looks like it's getting better instead of worse. Everyone else's. Ground is getting harder, more compacted, less productive every year. Yours is going the other direction. I wanted to know how you did it. My grandmother told me what my grandfather knew. The soil is alive. You feed it, it feeds you. You poison it, it dies slow." Dennis was quiet. Then he said, "Your grandmother was smarter than every agronomist I ever worked with." She'd have liked hearing that. Let me tell you where Warren Kepley ended up, because this story has one more chapter. By 2010, Warren had been farming without chemicals for 17 years. His 280 acres were the most productive and most profitable in McLean County on a per-acre net basis. His soil organic matter was approaching 7%, nearly triple the county average. His input costs were under $5,000, while his neighbors spent $50,000 or more. He started teaching. Not at a university. Warren had never been to college. He taught from his fields. He invited farmers to visit, walk the ground, dig the soil, see the earthworms, feel the difference. Between 2010 and 2020, over 300 farmers visited the Kepley farm. Many of them went home and started transitioning their own operations. Warren also did something his grandfather would have understood. He kept Arthur's old farm records on the kitchen table, open to the pages that showed the math. $12 per acre in costs, $180 per acre in net profit, no chemicals, no debt. Every farmer who visited saw those numbers first, before they ever walked into the field. The technology everyone's selling you didn't exist 60 years ago, Warren would tell them. And 60 years ago, farmers were keeping more money per acre than you are now. Think about what that means. Warren Kepley is 65 years old now. He still farms all 280 acres. Still uses cover crops, still hasn't applied a chemical in 33 years. His son, Kevin, manages half the operation and farms an additional 160 acres of his own the same way. 4 of Warren's neighbors have transitioned to cover crops after seeing his results. 2 more are in the process. The 280 acres of McLean County black dirt that Dennis Corrigan said would be dead in 3 seasons is the healthiest soil in the county, maybe in the state. Arthur Kepley's ledger still sits on the kitchen table. Dorothy Kepley died in 2001 at 92, knowing her grandson had proved her right. The soil is alive. You feed it, it feeds you. You poison it, it dies slow and takes you with it. So let me leave you with this. Right now, somewhere, someone is being told they need to keep buying what they've always bought, keep spraying what they've always sprayed, keep spending what they've always spent. Someone is being told that the system works, and questioning it is dangerous. The chemical rep told a 32-year-old farmer he was killing his soil, said his yields would collapse, said he'd lose the farm, said he'd come crawling back. 15 years later, during the worst drought in 20 years, that farmers' fields were the only ones still green. His soil was the healthiest in the county, and he was making more money per acre than anyone around him, not because he found something new, but because he went back to something old. Because Warren understood something the chemical rep couldn't see from inside his company truck. The soil doesn't need you to add to it. It needs you to stop taking from it. If this story changed how you think about what's necessary and what's just expensive, do 3 things. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of American agriculture. Drop a comment and tell me, what's something you stopped buying or stopped doing that everyone said you needed, and what happened? And share this with someone who's being told they can't afford to stop when the truth is they can't afford to keep going. The chemical rep said he was killing his soil. The soil was more alive than anything in the county, and the ledger on the kitchen table proved that the old way was the smart way all along. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.